This is Art Sense, a podcast focused on educating and informing listeners about the past, present, and future of art. I'm Craig Gould. On today's episode, I speak with Lisson Gallery partner and curatorial director Greg Hilty. Hilty sits down to discuss the upcoming exhibit Matter as Actor, which explores themes of multiplicity, interconnectedness, natural forces, raw materials, shared experiences, and our response to the physical world. The show opens May 3rd at Lisson Gallery in London and runs through June 24th. And now, a conversation about living in a material world with curator Greg Hilty. Greg Hilty, thank you so much for joining me this week on the Art Sense podcast. Greg, you're a partner at Lisson Gallery in London, where you serve as the curatorial director. And I wanted to have a conversation with you this week about a new show that's coming up that you've curated called Matter as Actor, which is coming up, I believe it's May 3rd, June 24th. Greg, how would you start to describe this new exhibit to a prospective visitor? How would you describe what they're going to see when they show up?
Thank you, Craig, and thank you for having me on this platform. I want this to be an exhibition where viewers can experience a wide variety of radically different ways to connect deeply to the material world. I guess that's how I would describe it, as kind of simply and fundamentally as possible. Too often, I think exhibitions are defined in terms of an idea or of a history, and I'd encourage people to come to any exhibition, and this one in particular, as an experience, an experience through the objects of art, through the material that artists have drawn on physically or elusively to make their works. Art can offer a direct physical engagement between something made to be seen and somebody in the mood for seeing. And the artists in this show, we have 12 artists from 5 continents, all see matter as an active force for change. That is not something passive to be consumed or used. I like to quote the anthropologist Tim Ingold, who's been a big influence on some of the ideas in the exhibition, who says the properties of materials aren't just attributes, but histories. So if I can establish that central premise for the show, the premise of matter as actor, then I'd say, just answering a little bit further your question, there are actually 3 interconnected stories that I'd like to engage visitors with. One is the multiplicity of relations between all things in the material world, and in particular interest the plurality of relations between humans and matter. And the second is the way that art can embody those multiple relations in a powerful and direct way. This is an art exhibition. It's not a lecture. It's not a text. It's something to be experienced. And third, the way that different artistic practices, whether of individuals or cultures developed over time, can be shared and understood even between people of radically different backgrounds and traditions. So for me, that's very important. It's a kind of subtext to the main text of the show, but it's a crucial one.
Greg, help me understand, as a curator, where do you start with an idea? Because I know you mentioned Tim Ingold. I know that in the catalog that accompanies the show, there are a number of quotes. Does it start with the matter of you reading and you start finding a connection of dots in the things that are of interest to you, and you see some hazy premise that can become something based on the artists that you guys have relationships with?
It's a good question, and there's not a recipe, there's not a formula for it. I've been a curator within public institutions, and I'm acting as a curator now within a commercial gallery that represents 60 artists. And our main focus is on those artists, on developing their work, presenting their work, both within the gallery and through museums. But through those relationships, artists always recommend other artists. Artists have people that they work with. And there's always a wider context around the artists that you work with. And as a gallery, we're very interested in that wider context. We're interested in the bigger picture, and we're always looking. People within galleries, people within museums are always looking. So, no, I'd say it doesn't start with ideas first. It starts with work. It starts with seeing work, with maybe finding somebody in a biennale somewhere or in a gallery somewhere. We work all over the world, and we see a lot of work together. And I guess constellations begin to form. You find common themes or kind of recurrences of things that just trigger something in your mind, and they relate to other things in your life. Indeed, artists are reading, artists are influenced by other kinds of discipline. And particularly, I guess, over the last couple of years, I've been trying to read quite extensively across a wide range of disciplines. And I must say, with the pleasure of breakfast conversations with my son, who's an anthropologist and a filmmaker, and these things have come together into, I hope, quite a simple and essential framework to look at quite complex and diverse ideas. As a curator, I like diversity, I like multiplicity, and yet I like to sort of try to bring them together into a context that is comprehensible.
On the podcast, one of the recurring topics that's come up with artists over the past couple of years, it seems that the best work is often a reflection of the place that an artist has come from. It's a reflection of their roots, or it's just grounded in the reality of a specific geography. And I feel this sense of place is a strong component of this exhibit. Can you talk about how some artists are evoking the history or scars of a specific place through their compositions, while others are actually using the physical materials harvested or recycled from a specific area to make that connection?
I think you're absolutely right. I think place is an essential prerequisite of work. Geography can also often be seen as a barrier. Things from far away can be seen as alien, incomprehensible in terms of language, or incommensurable, to use a powerful, if kind of jargony idea, relating to what we see as the fundamental limits of understanding things that are far away from us or different from us. And if you look at high-level cultural outputs, the products of any particular culture or personality, then things often are conveyed through systems that are too complex or too sophisticated to be easily translatable. But if you go right back to that fundamental human relation to the material world, then you're starting literally from a common ground. So that even if you build something different, you can understand the starting point, the motivation. So I agree, the best work reflects the place that it comes from. When things become too kind of flattened or streamlined, they can lose the ability to engage. In culture, we see this as a kind of global homogeneity, and we know how alienating that can be. And a richer kind of globalism is to acknowledge and respect that specificity. And, when you talk about this, you don't necessarily have to look so far afield. That sometimes surprising things aren't that far away. In the exhibition, we show work by an artist, Emil Kamp, who is a German architectural photographer who began by studying metallurgy in the 1950s. And we're showing a selection of black and white photographs from his series called Zinc, which was made in the late 1970s. She takes essentially portraits of buildings from a small area on the German-Belgian border around a place called Kelmis, where zinc was mined for centuries. And drawn from the ground, this zinc shaped the landscape and the lives of the people there. Its most obvious presence is the sheets of cladding on buildings, all with unique shapes and decoration. At a micro level, zinc is present in people. And then at a societal level, the unique economy of zinc mining meant that this tiny, tiny patch of land was actually independent of its surrounding nations for 100 years between the end of the Napoleonic Wars and the start of the First World War. And then there's also a fascinating connection between the surface of the zinc that's depicted, that captures time and weather, as well as human intervention, and the nature of black and white photography that materially captures light. So yes, in these different ways, place is very, very resonant.
In the show, there's also the work of Australian Aboriginal artist Dee Harding, who's working with materials harvested from his geography. I know Richard Long has a history of using clay from the river that he feels like tied to his ancestral roots. It's beyond representing in form, what is going on. It's actually getting to the heart of the composite materials in the work is tied to who these artists are in the experience that they grew up with, correct?
Yes, and Richard Long is a really interesting example. I was actually speaking with him just this weekend. His work is very well known for either photographing or writing about or literally presenting in the gallery, as you say, works from the ground, mud or rocks. And there's a material objectivity, there's a modesty, there's just a factuality really about his work that speaks for itself, and it has a kind of mute presence, a very powerful mute presence. But what I found interesting about our conversation over the weekend was how much can come out of that. Richard speaks about animals, for instance. Animals aren't a subject of his work, but as somebody who travels through nature, who engages with nature over decades, they're immensely present around the work. They form a surrounding and a kind of accompaniment to the material presence of his work. So they're very strongly there, even though you don't see them. They're often there actually in some of the text works. Sleep is important. So that the kind of human rhythms of walking, moving, and then resting and sleeping aren't conveyed in the works, but they are an essential component of the work, because he couldn't make them. If you're traveling miles through open countryside, you've got to rest. With rest come dreams. And dreams also focus, they're the subject of some of the text works that Richard writes. He some artists paint their dreams. The surrealists famously painted dreams. Richard doesn't. He doesn't present that in a kind of as an overt storyline, but it's really important to know that it's such an essential aspect of his thinking around the work that has this very straightforward presence. You mentioned Dee Harding, and thank you for raising him. Dee Harding has a really specific place within this exhibition as an Aboriginal artist from Australia. He works with materials and stories, and you might say protocols for engaging with the land of their ancestors. Dee doesn't use materials or forms that have their origins in other parts of the country. For example, sand or bark. Those relate to other peoples, other languages, other cultures, and Dee, they're not his to use, really, so he doesn't. So in our exhibition, there's work made of ochre and kaolin from Dee's grandmother's country. But what's interesting about him, land, even as ancient a land as his, isn't static or inert. And obviously colonization has brought new material relations. So Dee uses a blue pigment that has an intensity and a brightness that looks almost like lapis lazuli. Mm-hmm. Actually, it's a bleach. It's called Reckitt's Blue. And it was used in domestic service by many Aboriginal women who were taken from their communities. Mm-hmm. Very different. You set that alongside the ancient materials that had been used traditionally. And I asked Dee what it meant to carry these materials outside their place of origin, as far afield from Australia to London. And I thought his answer was really revealing. Dee speaks powerfully about how their mother, deprived of direct access to her historic landscapes, finds connection to that landscape and its histories through her son's representations of it. So there's a kind of recuperation of a lost relationship, because that land, in many cases, of the ancestors is no longer available. and also about how there's traditionally a generosity in the community's sharing of stories of the land, as long as it's done on their terms and with mutual respect. So Dee's work is carrying forward this generous tradition of sharing, which I find fascinating.
When we began, you mentioned that the exhibition includes the work of a host of artists spanning 5 continents. I think what we find is that we as humans are dealing with very similar things regardless of our geography, that there's a commonality between these artists in terms of what they're dealing with ecologically and the things that kind of connect us as humans on a macro level and what these artists are thinking of on a micro level, right?
Yes, absolutely. And by chance, just a couple of days after Madras Actor begins in London, we're opening an exhibition of paintings in our New York gallery by the Chinese artist Liu Xiaodong. And his works, painted in a realist tradition that fuses both Western and Chinese traditions, they're highly specifically rooted in a particular place in China. There's a region called Shanbei, which many of us in the West generally know very little about. It's a particular place where Mao and his communist forces were based for some time before their final push for power. So it's really iconic in the mythology of the People's Republic. So the artist shows that, but the people that he paints in situ, he actually paints en plein air, very unusually for a contemporary artist. He shows young kids hanging out in that historic landscape, wearing Gucci knockoff clothes, playing video games. And place can be at once highly specific, historic, distant, and current and relatable. And it's important that we understand that.
I wouldn't say that the exhibit is expressly about environmental concerns, but I feel like one of the things that does connect us as a human race right now is our concern for the environment. And I think one of the sub-themes that we can see in the show could be categorized as environmental injustice. Can you kind of talk about where we see that in the exhibit?
Sure. It is an important subject. I guess to be honest, I wanted to be a little bit careful for this not to be seen as an environmental exhibition. You know, people can get alienated from exhibitions that wear their messages too overtly on their sleeves. And, you know, if you have that alienation, then you lose people. And without real engagement, you end up not communicating anything. And it absolutely isn't, because I feel that the environmental situation isn't critical or that artists shouldn't address it. Lisson Gallery is a founder member of the Gallery Climate Coalition, and we're working hard to reduce our carbon footprint, as are many galleries, many museums, many other institutions within the art world and in the wider world. But apart from a sense of justice or self-interest or even guilt, I think art is one of the means by which people can comprehend what you might call the ontological foundations of environmental justice. If everything depends on everything else, in a complex web of relationships of power and agency, as this exhibition proposes, then of course you need to respect all the interrelated behaviors around those relationships. So colonization, extraction, monopolization, degradation have no place in a world where relationships exist in a powerful but delicately constructed balance. So I'm trying to sort of get to the fundamentals, ontological fundamentals as I describe them, and depicted through the presence of art in its own terms to convey the underpinnings of what might be the environmental, more overt environmental subject. There are works in the show by artists for whom environmental justice is a key preoccupation. Ottobong Nakanga is a very important example. She uses organic and non-organic matter through installation, performance, photography, sculpture, and other media to convey very complex stories about the relations between the global North and the global South. So yes, the subject matter is in the exhibition. Overall, it takes a bit of a step back from that as a specific subject.
I understand that Orban Nkenga will be performing at an opening on the 2nd of May. Can you tell us a little bit about what visitors would have in store for them at that event?
Well, I'm hoping that visitors and we have in store to be surprised. So I'm not going to talk about it, but she has made performances using the sculptures in the exhibition before. It changes from time to time, and it changes in the specifics of the exhibition. So we're going to have to wait until Tuesday the 2nd to find out.
I feel like the exhibit is about our interconnected species. It's how we interact with the physical world. But I feel like there are certain pieces that really look closely at the state of matter, the unique properties of physical materials, right? Some of the really captivating pieces in the exhibit utilize natural forces in their creation, like Lauren Casadilla's work with an electromatic process, or the work of Lucy Raven. Can you kind of talk about the beauty and natural order, and how we as humans can respond to these unique things that we see these artists capturing using what would be natural forces?
You're absolutely right to point that as an important sub-theme in the exhibition, which actually begins with the work of Lauren Calzadilla and their work. It's one piece that does appear as an organic abstraction. Its medium is magnetite, which is iron oxide, and the filings of iron oxide are placed on linen and subjected to an electric current, an electromagnetic force that moves the filings into these sort of pulsing patterns that are then fixed into the rather beautiful abstract composition that you see in the work. But so yes, there is this sort of sense of essential physical force. But what you see is only the end product of multiple complex relationships that are conveyed in the work's very long title. The title recognizes the date of the action, the charge of the electricity, even the specifics of the number of the meter that measured it, its cost in dollars, the subsidies that lay behind this cost. So Lauren Calzadilla are clearly recognizing the interwoven physical, economic, and political forces that ended up in this particular work of art. Lucy Raven is actually facing, her work is facing the work of Lauren Calzadilla. We're showing about 20 out of 60 existing works from Shadowgram series. These works are very mysteriously beautiful. Like a lot of the work in the show, they have an abstract appearance that belies the highly specific context that they were made in. We talked about Dee Harding, Lauren Calzadilla. And again, with Lucy, there's the specifics of making the work, which connects both actually and metaphorically to the wider context. So yeah, we're showing about 20 works, shadowgrams, that are the representation of a physical effect that you cannot actually see. So in this case, she's recording the elemental pressures of air and raw materials from explosive events, which she achieves by exposing photographic paper for microseconds after a detonation. So you might say that the event and the work are really one and the same thing. She went to considerable lengths to build a special room-sized camera to achieve this. And like Lauren Calzadilla, the wider context explains the specifics of her action. These were made on an explosives range in New Mexico, a place called Socorro, from the time of the Spanish settlers' interaction with Piro Native Americans. And it's a little ironic because the word socorro means succor or relief, whereas this place has become a site for testing nuclear weapons. So the rather gentle abstraction of the work carries residues of violence, both physical and political.
That work in particular, I feel like you really would have to get up close to it to really appreciate just the wonder of a natural process that we're just not capable of seeing. You're kind of looking into the abyss, and that abyss is created in a microsecond in a man-made natural phenomenon. And so on a lot of levels, you're looking into something that it's kind of fantastic, right?
It's really interesting that you identify it in that way, and I think you're absolutely right. And when you say fantastic, which means many things, it's not in itself a creation of the mind. It's a creation of the physics of the external world allied with the physics of human perception. So I guess, although it's not, so it's basically an image of something that doesn't exist. It's an image of a process, of a kind of pulse of energy. And although it's different, if you're trying to understand what it feels like, you might compare it to what happens when you're out in the bright sunshine and you stare at the sun and then you turn away and you get this residual image that you can see. It's very powerful, but it's like it's a kind of burning imprint, within the eye that remains as an image, and it remains not just as an immediate image, but that kind of imagery, the imagery from within the mind, can influence the way that we see things. There's evidence. There's a wonderful book by a South African anthropologist called The Mind in the Cave, who relies on or draws on physiologically generated images of that kind to help explain some of the way that ancient humans made images in caves. There's an interrelation between in the cave paintings between the images that were already inside people's heads, like that, what they saw in nature, where they chose to record their images, which were in caves which had no natural light. So they were using torches to illuminate them. So there was a kind of flickering insubstantiality and the shape of the cave. So I think while that's not directly conveyed within this exhibition, that kind of relation between the internal physiology of our brains, what we see, what we use to depict things, and where we depict them, those are all intimately related, and they are the cumulative meaning of the work of art.
This conversation about Lucy Raven's work also reminds me of a particle accelerator like CERN and this crashing of particles in a way that we can never see in the natural world, but we're trying to get some impression of what that wonder is in those moments that are really sort of not visible to our naked eye, right?
Absolutely. And just coming back to the beginning of the exhibition where we show Alain Calsadilla and Lucy Raven, within the same room is work by a very, very different artist, Zhan Wang, a Chinese sculptor from Beijing, who I saw an exhibition of his in Beijing maybe 10 years ago, which was the remnants or the traces of an action that he carried out where he took a boulder into the desert and blew it up, basically. And then he recovered the fragments of this explosion. And his habit is to take rocks, either rocks that he created in that way or the old Chinese tradition of scholars' rocks, so rocks that are found from nature and really presented just as themselves to be contemplated for what they tell us is in a kind of meditative way about the natural world. But he hammers steel over them and then removes the steel, and so there's an image of the rock made in steel. So the exhibition that I talked about had thousands of fragments of steel frozen in air as if they were flying through space, which was an incredibly powerful project. In this exhibition, he's taken this same idea of the scholar's rocks. He's then split the rocks so that you have both a natural surface and a very smooth human surface. And one of the points of the steel, I mean, it's interesting visually because it reflects, the world around it, whereas a rock is a kind of obdurate thing that is just present, whereas the steel brings the world into it and it makes it kind of more liquid. So he's made a number of these pieces. They're cumulative. There's one piece, then the next one on a separate plinth has two pieces, and then three. It's not quite as sort of mathematical as that, but there's a sense of a kind of growing. And he's interestingly connecting these. He was very inspired, actually, I'm pleased to say, by the theme of the exhibition, and he's decided to connect it to Genesis, to the Bible, to the creation of the world, and the idea of out of nothing, from material and from language, the world taking shape. So he's presenting these works. He's actually asked us to change the configuration every week, so there'll be a different kind of logic. And what I also find interesting is that he's made ink drawings. There's a whole ink tradition, which is well known, of calligraphy, for instance, and landscape painting in China, that's very different from much contemporary art. And in some ways, he's bringing it together there. He's invoking some of the traditions and philosophies of Taoism and their relevance, the idea of this continuum, really, of material and of existence and thought that has a very ancient representation and articulation in Taoist philosophy. And it's represented in quantum physics. So I think these things they're all out there. They're ideas and ways of looking at the world that apply to different generations and different cultures at different times. And I guess I'm trying to provide a framework where contemporary works by contemporary artists dealing with their own material, their own historical conditions, can be seen for what they say to each other.
The ink drawings that you referred to, Taoist tradition and quantum physics, that particular work, my understanding is that there's this mark making, but he's using rules that marks can abet each other, but they're not able to touch. And I know my son is rather into science and was sharing a video with me one time about how we don't actually touch things, that on a quantum level, at the atomic or quark level, we don't actually physically come in contact with the world around us. That reminds me of what's going on in this particular work.
Absolutely. I find that rule, as you describe it, a fascinating one. You wouldn't necessarily know it when you look at the works. It looks like kind of fluid forms moving in and out of each other. But when you look closely, indeed, none of the marks touch each other. So there's different patterns that he uses and that he creates in each work, but they're from a series of individual marks put together that exist independent of each other, but they only make sense in relation to each other. And if there was a way of describing the ideas behind this exhibition, that's a good way of summing it up. The sense of relationality, that's really behind this idea of matter as actor. I'm not proposing, and most of the artists in the exhibition wouldn't follow a philosophy of, say, animism, where inanimate material has has consciousness. That's fine. There's long traditions of that, and it's extremely interesting. But the show doesn't depend on that. The idea of matter as actor is that material substances exist in relationship to each other and have a profound impact on each other. And so we're trying to show different ways of looking at that relationality.
Going back to your role in pulling all of this together, how long does it take someone who's curating a show like this to go from concept to finding the right cast to the logistics of pulling it all together and getting it on a schedule? How long have you been working on putting this particular show together?
I guess when you ask me that, I probably have had an idea of doing a show like this, kind of connecting elements within an Earth system for, I don't know, 5 or 6 years. This show was realized in about 7 months. The idea, the opportunity to do an exhibition, that kind of constellation that I mentioned earlier on about recognizing a certain number of artists who somehow make sense together, and then providing the framework that unites them. But I find that, as a curator, that's really exciting. That's the way things work. The ideas can be brewing in a way, and then they come together very quickly. I have to say also, I think it's really important to say that this show, as many that I work in, but this one in particular, has been very much a collaborative effort. It's come from dialogues with artists, with colleagues who have particular relationships with artists. And it's been very much a group effort. So, different colleagues have recommended different people. They've engaged in developing the ideas with different artists. I've kind of orchestrated it. I've tried to get the theme. I've tried to bring it together. I've tried to place different works in relation to each other, like describe the first 3 artists who have that kind of connection with, let's say, raw physics, more than some of the more representational works that follow later. So that's my role. But I find that as a curator enormously satisfying to be able to draw together inputs from different places, including from my colleagues.
Did it come together as you hoped? I know sometimes I talk to curators and they hoped they were going to get a particular piece, but it didn't free up, or they were hoping to get the input of a particular artist. Did everything come together the way you hoped it would?
Well, this is a subject that's kind of open-ended subject, so many more people could be included. But a show is a show at a particular time. There's the kind of cliche that it's never finished, it's just open. And it's going to open. And I have to say, I'm very happy with the shape that this show has taken. So no, it could be different. It could have changed. I think it's in the nature of the subject, let's say, that there's always that possibility. But I think an exhibition is a sort of snapshot of a moment. And this one I'm pleased with.
Well, Greg, I really appreciate your time today. Encourage people to go out and see the show in London, May 3rd to June 24th. The show is Matter as Actor at 27 Bell Street and 67 Lisson Street. Greg, I really appreciate you sharing your vision and providing insights on this so that people will understand and appreciate the show at the level that's intended. And I really appreciate you sitting down and opening up with me today.
Thank you very much for the conversation. I've really enjoyed it.
That's all the time we have for this week. You've been listening to Art Sense. You can find the show on Apple Podcasts, iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher Radio, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. If you've enjoyed this podcast, be sure to subscribe. And while you're there, please rate the show and leave a quick review. Your feedback is the key to other folks finding us. And if you'd like to see images related to the conversation, read the transcript, and find other bonus features, you can go to cambia.art and click on the podcast tab. If you'd like to reach out to me, you can email me at craig@cambia.art. Thanks for listening.